I've taught 3D artists at companies like Disney and Blizzard, and I've taught people on their very first day of learning. Do you know what's the same about these two groups? I teach them the exact same 3-step plan, and I'm going to teach it to you right now. And if you'd like to learn everything I know about digital sculpting, of course, check out the Appeal Academy, link below. And now on to my 3-step plan, let's get into it. Okay, let's get right into it. So the first step of my 3-step plan is block out. Many of you have probably heard of block out before, but maybe didn't understand exactly what it is. And if you did understand what it is, I want to clarify that and give some tips within that space. Specifically, 3 tips that we're gonna look at, starting off with focusing on silhouette. So this is a character that I sculpted based on a concept from Maya Lior. We'll look into this more as we continue forward, but let's go ahead and start off here with this most basic block out. So all the way from this, I know it doesn't look like much right now, all the way to this finished character. You can see she doesn't even have legs in the original block out here. But let's go ahead and talk about this first one, which is silhouette. So if you are unfamiliar with silhouette, I'll do a quick demonstration of what that kind of looks like here in 3D. So silhouette is essentially the outline of the 3D shapes that you are creating. If we look at this from the side, we can see the profile of this character, and we don't get any of that excess information, any of the curvature of the form, any of the secondary details, any textures, any color, anything like that, just silhouette. And this is exactly what you should be focusing on when you are creating your character in the early stage. For example, I'll just toggle off a couple pieces here very quickly, and let's just take a look at this most basic shape for the head. So if we break down this shape, you could say it's essentially a sphere with a point for the chin, a little bit elongated, maybe bigger at the top. We have the ears on the side, and that is essentially the shape or basic silhouette that we are trying to capture in the beginning. This is extremely important to focus on because it keeps us from moving ahead too fast, and it keeps us focused on what's most important during the early stages of creating your 3D character. Okay, let's turn off the silhouette mode so I can talk about our second point here in a little more detail, which is absolutely no additional forms or features. So if you take a look at this character, you'll notice that there is no facial features, there's no eyes, there's no nose, mouth, anything like that. So during this stage, once you're working on your silhouette and you start to make that more 3-dimensional, give it depth, give it actual form, to focus in on that block out, on that primary form, we want to avoid getting ahead of ourselves and creating all these secondary features. So you can see in the arm, I'm not creating hands. If I did have hands on this character right now, they would simply be like little paddles, maybe cubes or makeshift spheres, something really simple. The ears don't have a lot of form, you can see with that. If anything, I would say I've done even too much form at this stage. We could simplify those even more into something like that. Our goal here being, once again, to focus on what really matters, which is the block out. The reason why this is so important early on is because once we get to those stages where we are creating eyes, noses, etc., the secondary features that live on top of primary features, if the primary form is incorrect, no amount of sculpting and refinement and making those different facial features, etc., really beautiful is going to make any difference if our primary shape is incorrect. You can't put good stuff on top of bad stuff. It might look good individually by itself, but as a whole, it's still going to look incorrect and wrong. All right, my third tip for blocking out your character is to add hair, add clothing, and add color to your character. First, just talking about color, it's really important to put that information on early, in my opinion. It really helps figure out your proportions and gets everything kind of feeling closer to the finished character. It's a really easy one to do as well. When I started sculpting, I would never put hair on my characters in these really early stages, and that actually came back to bite me a lot later in the process. I didn't realize early on how important the hair was to the overall proportion and silhouette of the character. So now whenever I block out my characters, and what I teach other students of mine is that it is extremely important to put that hair on there early to get an overall sense for the character. And then finally, the third thing there, which is clothing. If you take a look at my character's clothing, for instance, You can see that there's no body underneath it. And that is simply because this character's body is never going to be seen. It's not going to be used for any nefarious purposes. It also isn't going to be ever seen in a different outfit. So there's no reason for me to go ahead and create all that additional form. The legs just stop right there underneath the skirt. There's no additional form going on under there because there's no reason to do that. The same thing is true if you're creating shoes for a character. My favorite example, which is no need to make feet if your character is never going to be seen without shoes. It is simply a waste of time unless you want the additional practice. And the same thing is true here when you're creating clothing for your character. All right, let's move on and talk about step 2, which is refinement. So refinement is kind of a general term that I think a lot of people throw around. So I'd like to add some clarity about how we go about the process of jumping from something so simple to start adding a lot more additional information to this character, because this is obviously a huge jump from A to B. And that's exactly why I'd like to break down this step of refinement once again into 3 individual steps of things that I think are really important for you to focus on. So the first thing that you really need to focus on during the step of refinement is secondary form. Specifically, when we're talking about secondary form, what that is form that lives on top of other form. So you can think of this head shape as a primary form. Remember that silhouette example that we looked at earlier? That's exactly what we're looking at here. So basic, round, no additional shapes, nothing that's affecting the silhouette. Then we start to build that form that's going to live on top of that. Also keep in mind, it's not going to be perfect right away. Even with my stuff, you can see it goes through stages of development. With that idea of secondary form, I highly encourage all of my students and everybody that I work with to start on your character's face. The reason for that is the face is most likely, not true with every character, but most likely going to be the focal point of your character. And when that is the case, it is important that you put the most amount of work into your focal point. Additionally, it helps get the character to that, more finished feeling a lot faster. If you have a more finished face with everything else blocked out, I'd much rather have that than a completely non-started face with all the additional forms and other things, figured out at this stage. So it's really important to start working on that face early. Also, during the stage of refinement, I really recommend starting to work on secondary forms such as clothing folds and additional pieces of hair. So as you can see, as I step up through this character, you can see the hair is just really, really basic here initially. But as I step forward, I start with the face, I continue working on the face while starting to do some additional changes here to the hair. And then finally, I'm starting to think about those individual pieces that are going to live on top of the forehead here for the bangs, maybe some of the extra pieces that I've started to, proportionally get into a better position to match the silhouette, all that additional information, working on that simultaneously. The one caveat to this that I will say is that if you are working on clothing and folds, do keep in mind that if you are going to pose your character later on, like I do with this character, it's really important not to do too much of the fold work before you break symmetry, otherwise you'll end up re-sculpting a lot of that information. Speaking of posing, speaking of breaking symmetry, we'll move on to step 3 of my process. So we've looked at blockout, we've looked at refinement, and now we're going to look at polish. So once again, a massive jump to go from something like this to this really finished character. So I'd like to again kind of break that down a little, as well as talk about 3 or 4 individual things that I really think are super important to focus on during this stage of creation. So let's rewind, right? Let's go back to that stage of refinement. You're here, you're looking at your reference, or you're maybe working from your imagination. How do you take this to the next stage? Well, the first thing that I recommend is break symmetry on your character as early in this part of the process as possible. It's going to add a lot more life to your character, and if you have a pose or a specific pose that you're going to be doing like I have here, it's really important that you start heading in that direction early so that you don't end up re-sculpting a lot of the things that you've already created. I mentioned that with folds earlier, but there's a lot of other places that can happen as well. So let's take a look at some of these steps as I continue forward into this part of polish. So once I start posing my character, you'll notice that the pose is extremely rough compared to that final version. There's just a lot more life going on. Additionally, there's a lot more cleanup going on in certain areas. If you take a look at this arm, a lot of this information just kind of got squashed and kind of broken. I do this a lot of the time because I treat my posing stage, and I teach my students to treat their posing stage much like you treat the block out phase of your character, which is to start really rough and then refine the pose. So just between these two steps, it really doesn't look like a ton is changing, but in fact there's quite a bit that's happening here. Obviously there's a little shift over with the hair, but most of the changes are happening here in the body, where I'm cleaning up a lot of that awkward information that kind of got broken during the stage of posing. You can also see I'm starting to add some of those clothing folds on there, a lot of the more detailed areas, the secondary shapes, and that is once again because now that my character is posed, I can, start sculpting those in without worrying about messing them up later because I'm already heading in that posed direction. So also during this stage, this is when we start thinking about details. You're looking at a simplified character like this, and you might say, hey, it's pretty simple, there's not that many details. You would be very wrong, because there are, in fact, quite a few details on this character. Specifically, let's take a look at the hair and just this huge change going back and forth from one step to another. You can see I'm starting to add a lot more information to the bangs. And if you take a look at these pieces, these are actually pretty kind of strange, if I'm being honest. The way I tackled this character in terms of breaking up these forms was very difficult because there's a lot of these interweaving shapes. So rather than do that, I decided to just kind of chop them up into these individual chunks of hair that I could later reform and recombine. So that's how I was able to kind of block those out. If you want to go back to that stage and think about that for larger chunks like your hair, that's how I was able to do that process here. So that's one way you can start looking at and thinking about details in terms of form, but we also don't want the color of our character to suffer, the paint job on our character. So you can see between these two steps, I am still continuing to work on form. There's a lot more stuff going on with the clothing. I'm starting to create pockets on the skirt while adjusting some of the form that's peeking through there, adding some folds onto the skirt, adding some additional sculpted form here to the hair, just keeping that really clean, refined, and polished. And also the face. We don't want to forget our face. We worked on it a lot earlier, but it still needs a lot of work during the stage of polish. And you can see that I've not only changed the proportions ever so slightly, small changes make big differences, but I've also worked on the paint job here quite a bit to push that into a more finished state. So it's really important for you to focus not just on your form during this stage, but also your paint. Moving on from here is not so much a part of polish, but moreover a really strong piece of advice that I have for you and that I teach all of my students, which is don't be afraid to make big changes even though you're at the end of working on your character or you're nearing the end of your project, right? So you can see here in the reference, the character was never drawn with full legs, and I reached to this stage of the character and thought to myself, well, it probably wouldn't be all that hard for me to add a pair of legs to this character, do some feet, and just, call this a full character rather than a bust. It wasn't that much more work for me to do. So I took the time to go ahead and do that, and I even made a smart decision about the feet to just create some simple shapes, kind of make those into socks. Because the feet weren't a huge focal point of this character, I could keep that form relatively simple without having to do a ton of extra work there. I have many students that reach this stage of polish and they have really large kind of glaring issues with their character, but they're afraid to go back and make those kinds of changes because they don't want to screw up what they already have. I would say 10 times out of 10, I would always recommend going back and making those changes because your character is going to just be that much better for it. So keep that in mind as you work on your characters. And then just like refining our character, we want to go over everything again to polish up what we already have. In this case, that involved a lot of little changes to my character. You can see a lot of that happening in the hair, some on the folds, a lot of little things, and then you can also see, hey, we got a knife now. What's that about? Well, there was this meme going around at the time. I'll throw it up on screen for you guys. Yeah, I know, pretty stupid, but it was just a fun little element that I could add in the reference. I couldn't see the character's hand, so I was like, you know what, let's give her a knife. Let's make her dangerous. And then I just want to show these last steps, going back and forth between these two. Because if you take a look at these steps, it really seems like not a lot is happening or changing, and you might not have even seen the difference between those two on a first cursory glance. So let me just show it one more time here. This step and this step, you can see that there's a little bit of proportional change here in the clothing, so we can kind of reveal this tighter area here a little more, so that's a little more obvious. You can also see, and you maybe didn't catch it, some really small changes starting to happen in the character's hair. I'll zoom in on that so I can kind of highlight it a little more. These are the final bits of polish that really help push your character to go from something that's good to great. So you can see I'm just cleaning up this form in the hair a little more, sharpening up certain areas, softening others, blending these pieces together, creating a really nice flow with these forms, starting to just make it, again, before and after, all together more visually appealing. Now, this was obviously a very zoomed out perspective on this process, so if you want to get into the nitty-gritty details of learning everything I know about digital sculpting, check out the Appeal Academy. There's a link below down in the description. And if you enjoyed this video, I think you'll also really enjoy this one where I show you my lazy guide to fast improvement. Guaranteed to work, or I'll give your view back. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.